a really good job with that. It's a little bit weird. All right, cool. So I am Bermon, and I do have a handlebar mustache. And I initially grew the handlebar for a conference in St. Pete down in Florida a couple of years ago. And it was the first conference I'd ever spoken at. And I promised the organizer that if he'd let me speak, I'd grow a handlebar mustache. So he let me speak, and I grew it, and I rebranded all my stuff to have the handlebar mustache so I could do things like this and to see a gargantuous mustache on the screens. And I haven't been able to shave it because now everybody expects a handlebar mustache. So I'm stuck with it. My wife giggles at me, but it's not too bad. So I'm involved in Charlotte and do a handful of meetup groups. I do one for front-end developers, one for UX folks. I just wrapped up a conference in Charlotte called BlendConf. It's a generalist conference with designers, developers, UX, front-end, back-end, no devices, tasty food, lots of fun. So winding down, I come up here to speak at another conference. So it worked out pretty well. Now I work full-time for a company based out of Cincinnati called Cardinal. We're a consultancy and do lots of odds and ends. And I do UX and front-end and design things with them. And it works out pretty well. So today, we're here to talk about front-end workflows with Gulp. So as a precursor, I'm kind of a designer that dabbles a lot in front-end, a little bit in back-end. Do mostly things with Ruby. So I've been accustomed to doing, working with Rails and Sinatra and Web Machine and just odds and ends on that end of it. So JavaScript-y things are a little bit new to me to do just everything in JavaScript. So I've been dinking around a lot with Grunt, so that's what I'm accustomed to. And I committed to do this presentation to force myself to transition over to Gulp. So who's never used Grunt before? A few folks? Maybe who uses Grunt? Yeah, okay. That's where the folks are. Who uses Gulp currently? A few folks? You can correct my errors if there are any. All right. So I dig Grunt. It's a really fantastic way to create a build system to automate. I'm lazy. So it's a great way to automate tasks that I just want to do, don't want to have to do over and over again. So they're both kind of the same, but some of the core concepts of Gulp is as it's a build system, a task runner. It's a great way to automate workflows. And in my case, since the majority of the work that I do is on the front end, I have it automate a lot of really nifty front-endy things. Like I use Sass, obviously. So a lot of Sass stuff, compiling my Sass to CSS. Or who uses it? I like to ask this question if I know there are front-end folks in the audience. So who uses Sass? Handful of folks. How about Les? Who uses Stylus? Yeah, I like you, guy with the beard. So I really like Stylus. Stylus is great because it's super terse. And again, I'm lazy, so it means I have to type less. I never learned to type in high school. I never took keyboarding, so it's kind of crappy, but I get by. So I like anything that forces me to type less. So all those simple things like handling files, starting up quick servers, optimizing images, concatenating, minifying, all those typical front-end things that you could do with Grunt, you can also do with Gulp. So in that sense, they're fairly similar. So real quickly for the folks that are new to Gulp, this is kind of the workflow, kind of how you get up and running. It is built on top of Node, which is super nice. So you basically you install Node, you install Grunt, or Gulp, sorry. I'm going to mix those up the entire time, I'm sure. So you install Gulp. You set up a package.json file, which is kind of Node's way to manage dependencies and odds and ends. You create a Gulp file, and this is where all the magic kind of lives. So it lives in your Gulp file. You write your Gulp tasks, an amazing thing happens. All right, so really quickly, if we install Node, for the folks on a Mac that don't like compiling things from source, even if you're on Windows, there's a nice binary installer. You can just click on it. It'll install Node for you, and it has NPM built in as well. So it'll install the Node package manager. So if you're not familiar with Node or NPM, Node is roughly the equivalent of Ruby. NPM is basically just like your gem file. So you're just managing little packages of things that do specific tasks. If you're from the .NET world, if you do .NET, it'd be like you have C# and NuGet. If you use PHP, I have no idea what the equivalent would be. I assume they have some type of package manager, PHP people? Yes, no? No? I have no idea. There was no, yes, it does. So I assume there aren't too many PHP folks in the crowd. So I have no idea how PHP people manage packages and dependencies. So in the command lines, if you're afraid of the command line, don't be. You're going to need to learn it. So you just use Node Package Manager, NPM for short. You install -G, which is global. So you're going to install Gulp globally, right? So embrace the command line. You'll need it. If you're on a Mac like I am, you'll probably get an error saying that you don't have permissions to install that. Just use sudo, and that'll take care of it for you. The second step is you set up your package JSON file. Now, Node's pretty good, is it'll kind of walk you through setting up this file, at least at the most basic level. Now, the package JSON file typically lives in your root directory, and it just defines some basic metadata about the name of the project, the version numbers, any other type of descriptive text that describes what it is or what it does, and then your dependencies, your other packages that you need to install to make it work. So Node will walk you through. So just do npm init. It'll walk you through everything. And the bare minimum that you need to get this up and running, you just need a name and a version. And it would look something kind of like that. So you can name your plugin or your project wherever you want. You give it a version, and you're good to go. And that'll prevent Node things from screaming at you. Now, we've already installed Gulp globally, right? So back here, we installed Gulp globally for the entire system. What we need to do now is once we set up our package.json file, is we need to install that dependency just for our project, right? So we install that, and this is what we get. So we get an addition to our package.json file, right? So we get a dev dependencies, and it locks in Gulp for us, so we know that this project requires Gulp, and then it locks us in on a version number, which is pretty handy. All right, so once we get that set up, in most cases you only have to do your installation phase one time, right? So you can scratch that off your list once you've done it the first time. And then for every new project, you just set up a new package.json file, install your Gulp dependency, and you're ready to go writing Gulp files. So you can do the command line way. I assume this works on Windows. I have no idea. I'm a Unix guy. So you create a Gulp file, or you can do it the hard way and actually physically create the file with a mouse, if that's the way you want to go. Within your Gulp file, this is roughly what you would set up. It doesn't pre-populate this stuff for you. It'd be nice if it gave you a nice little scaffold, but it doesn't really do that as far as I know. If there are any Gulp folks that think that have a plugin that'll do that for you, let me know. That'll be great. So you're going to let it know that you're going to require Gulp up at the top. And then within your Gulp file, you have just a series of tasks and watchers and odds and ends that are doing the magic for you. And we'll dig into those here in a second. One caveat is that if you don't require Gulp in the beginning, it's not going to work. So you always have to require Gulp to make sure it works. And then you just write Gulp tasks like a madman or madwoman and can rock and roll. So to run your Gulp file in the terminal in your project, you just do Gulp, whatever the task name is, and it'll run that for you. So if you're minifying or concatenating, it'll run through that process or that specific task. All right, so we install Gulp, we install Node, we set up a package.json file, we create our Gulp file, get all that set up, write our Gulp tasks, and we're super happy. So within Gulp, there are three primary concepts. And this is what I like about Gulp, is that it's not very difficult to understand. There's not a lot to it, and it is relatively simple compared to other node-based things or other front-end-based things. So the first concept in Gulp is that we have this concept or ideas of plugins. So plugins are just little encapsulations of code or JavaScript that perform a singular task. So a plugin could be a specific set of code that concatenates a file, or minimize a file, or resizes an images, or compresses an image, compiles preprocessed code. So you can have any number of plugins that you want, but they should do one thing, and they should do it well. So that's kind of the approach that Gulp takes, is that you create a plugin, and it does a task, and it should do that task well. You don't want to mix a whole bunch of things inside a single plugin. You separate those out into separate tasks. So what this allows you to do within Gulp is it allows you to create and maintain an easy system of plugins, and you can combine those in fairly complex ways to create a larger Gulp file. So there are a lot of plugins over on the Gulp website. They keep growing and growing. There's a little over 800, and they're amazing. Now, Gulp does a pretty good job looking over or kind of managing the plugins they allow, kicking out ones that are depreciated. So things are fairly up to date. I wouldn't search on this on npm.org on the website because they don't really maintain all that. It's just a bunch of node plugins. The second concept we have are streams. So streams are roughly the way that we link various plugins together and have them do specific tasks. They help define how you move from one task to another. The third one, we have the tasks themselves. So tasks allow us to interact with plugins. So for example, if we want to take a series of JavaScript files, we want to minify those and concatenate and minify. We handle those in a couple of different tasks. So those tasks link all of these different plugins together, and then we can also define dependencies within a task. All right, so what some of you may be here for is Gulp versus Grunt. Now, I didn't go too far in depth. There are plenty of great blog posts that will just compare everything under the sun for both of them. I'm going to hit on two things that was mostly the deciding factor for me. So the first thing is that Gulp aligns itself to leaning towards code over configuration. Grunt is the complete opposite. So instead of having a series of Grunt configuration files, you just write code within your Gulp file, and that takes care of pretty much anything you need to do. The second thing, and the thing that kind of won me over in the beginning, is that Grunt is primarily file-based. So there's a lot of writing and reading files as you're going through a Grunt file. And then Gulp, on the other hand, is stream-based. Now, I believe in Grunt 1.0 that they're switching that, or they've switched to streams instead of file-based I/O. So currently in Grunt, or in previous versions of Grunt, there was fairly heavy I/O, and it slows things down because you're reading and writing things to the system. And this is kind of the way that it typically works. So let's say, for example, I'm a Sass guy. I like writing stuff in Sass. So one of the things that I do all the time is I have a series of Sass files in partials. I want to be able to concatenate all those files into a single Sass file and then convert that Sass file to CSS, minify the CSS, and serve that to the browser. So if I were doing this in Gulp or Grunt, I'll get that right eventually. They shouldn't start with the same letter. So in Grunt, let's say, for example, I have 3 Sass files. So for Gulp, it's going to be 3 reads, and then it's going to concatenate those files, and then it's going to write them to a combined Sass file. Then it's going to read that Sass file, and it's going to convert it to CSS. So it's going to write. Then it's going to read it again. It's going to minify everything. It's going to rename it, and then it's going to write the file as a CSS file. So we have 3 reads, a write, a read, a write, a read, and a write again. Now, if we were going to do this in Gulp, this is how it would look. So I would still have those same CSS files, Sass files. So I started with my 3 Sass files. Then Gulp has this concept of piping information in. So it's not going to consistently read and write. It's just going to pipe the information through, store that in memory, and do its magic there. So it's going to read the files, the 3 CSS files or Sass files. It's going to concatenate them, convert them to CSS, minify everything. It's going to rename them, and then it's going to write. So in the case of Gulp, we only have 3 reads. It's going to pipe 5 different options in, and then it's going to do 1 write. So we have 3 reads and a write, as opposed to Gulp, which would give us 3 reads, a write, a read, a write, a read, and then a final write. So the thing that slowed down Gulp or Grunt in the past was the I/O, consistently having to read and write to files. So Gulp has cleaned that up substantially, and you're only reading and writing typically on the beginning and on the end. You know, all the magical stuff in the middle. All right, so the three things that I liked about Gulp is that the lean towards code over configuration. I kind of dig that as a front-end person. I don't like writing a bunch of config files everywhere, maintaining those. The plugins have grown substantially, so they're fairly high quality. They do a pretty good job watching kind of what comes in. And then because they're not consistently reading and writing to the file system, it's fairly fast, fairly efficient, so there's low I/O. All right, so let's dig into the Gulp API and kind of see what it does. It's so hard. There's like 4 things, so it's pretty good. So the first part of the API is you have a Gulp task. Now, in Gulp task, you're basically just creating a name or registering a name for the type of task that you want to do. And then you can declare any dependencies if there are any. So say that I want to compile something first, and then after it's compiled, I want to minify and concatenate. Right? I wouldn't want to minify before I compiled if I was doing a SAS file. Basically what it does is it takes some type of source file and it passes it through whatever we define and then spits things out to some type of destination. So these are our tasks. They can do whatever we want inside, but basically we're just giving it a name, and eventually we're going to tell it to do some things. So say, for example, I was building a really simple build, and a build task where I wanted to compile my CSS, wanted to lint my JavaScript, and I wanted to compress images. There are already 3 plugins that exist for Gulp to do those. So I could just write a really simple task, call it build, and then call the dependencies of the plugins that I wanted to use. And then in my command line, it doesn't show it. In the command line, the only thing I have to do is do Gulp build, and it would run through those tasks for me. Gulp also has the concept of having a default task. So if I'm inside of a project and I just type Gulp, it's going to use that default. So you just call default there at the end, and then whatever plugins or tasks that you want it to run through as your default. All right, so the second part of the API is we have our source. So the source basically returns a readable stream. So it takes a glob of information, or basically a glob is a string that matches one or more files. So it could be a single file or an array of files, and it returns a stream that can be piped into the plugin. So we're taking that information that we've read in, we're piping it through whatever plugins, whether it's concatenation, minification, image resizing, whatever we want to call it, and it spits out a file. So in this case, if we had a source directory with some JavaScript, we could pipe that through and spit it out into some type of destination. So we're basically just picking a source, and we're telling it to do something to it, and then stick it somewhere else. Sticking it somewhere else is its own part of the API called Gulp Dest, or destination. So basically it allows us to write files to the file system. That's pretty much it. So in the case of doing something with SAS, we're going to take our initial source we want to pull the files from. So we're going to take any SAS file in our SAS directory. We're going to pipe it through the SAS preprocessor, and then we're going to pipe that through to whatever our destination is, wherever we want our processed CSS files to live. So in this case, we're taking our SAS files in our source SAS directory, and then we're spitting that out as CSS into our typical build assets directory. One of my favorite is the watch. A watch allows us to take a glob, again, a file or a set of files, pull for any changes that happen, and then automatically pipe those through and do whatever task we've defined. So in the case of SAS, what I don't want to have to do every time I make a change to a SAS file, or any other file really, I don't want to have to go to my command line and tell it to compile my SAS. So I can set up a watch command to go, all right, I want you to look at this directory, and anytime I make a change, go ahead and spit out a CSS file for me automatically. Again, I'm lazy, so I really dig that. We can set up a watch for our SAS files in our source directory and have it run the task compile. So the compile would do whatever we defined it to do, In our case, we're going to have it run everything through the SAS preprocessor and spit out a native CSS file. Okay, so another thing that you can do with watchers that I thought was really neat is that the information you get back into the terminal isn't the best sometimes. So you can do a few things whenever a file changes to spit out whether the file was added, changed, or deleted, and then spit out the file name. So in this case, whenever I change a CSS file or a SAS file, it's letting me know what I did. So did I add something to it? Did I delete it? Did I change something? And then it'll spit out the file name. So in the terminal, I can see what's going on. So it gives me a bit more human readable output. And just in case something goes wrong, I can kind of see where that's at. And that's it. So that's the entirety of the Gulp API. So to review real quick. So you're defining a task. Within the task, you're picking a file, right? The file that you want to mess with. And then you're going to spit that file out somewhere. And then, so you don't have to do that manually, you can watch it and have it do automation for you behind the scenes without having to physically manually go into the terminal and go, all right, do this thing every time I make a change. And that's it. All right, pretty simple. It's not too bad. That's Gulp. We're done. Thanks. Go home. No, so the nice thing about Gulp that they get from Node is it's so good at concurrency. So even though we're defining tasks in our Gulp file in somewhat of a linear fashion, that's not the way it processes the information. So it does the best way that it can to do as many things at once as it can. So Gulp uses something in Node called Orchestrator, which allows us to specify dependencies within tasks. So it takes advantage of streams that are built into Node, so it can run multiple tasks the best it can with maximum concurrency. So super fast, really nice. And you don't have to sit there and watch a terminal for it to do your CSS, then your HTML, then that. It'll do them all in tandem if it can. Okay, so let's talk about common workflow tasks. So we're going to come at this kind of as a front-end dev. I think that's where it's the most useful. So because I'm a SAS guy, or a preprocessor guy in general, again, I'm lazy, so I enjoy having things do things for me without having to type a lot because I can't type. So one of the things is we compile SAS. Now, we're lucky that there's pretty much a plugin that already exists for anything that you could think of for the most part. Otherwise, you could make a plugin and it's not too bad. So the first thing that we want to do if we're starting up a new project is we're going to install our SAS dependency. Note that there are two versions of SAS. There's the Ruby version of SAS, which is, if we're doing something that's dependent on Node, it's kind of silly to use the Ruby version. We're going to do that anyway. Like, you don't want to have to install Ruby and install Node and have those two separate language dependencies. The second version of SAS is called libSAS, which is actually the C implementation of SAS. And then they have various wrappers that work for Node or Ruby or PHP or .NET or Python or whatever else you can think of. So just in case you're a SAS person and you're wanting to use this to do SAS, use the libSAS version. It's a lot faster. And you don't have to worry about the Ruby dependency. But for this example, because I'm a Ruby guy, we're going to do Ruby. So we're going to set up our Ruby SAS dependency. We'll include it as a dependency in our Gulp file, and then we'll set up our simple Gulp task, right? So the Gulp task is pretty simple. We're going to give our task a name. We're going to call it compile SAS, and then within our function, we're going to tell it what we want to do. So we want it to return whatever we're going to declare. So we're going to first choose where our source SAS files are. So we use Gulp source, find the directory. Now we're going to use the asterisk, so we choose any SAS file. We're going to pipe that through our SAS preprocessor. And we're going to turn source maps on so it works nice with Chrome, so we can actually see our SAS stuff in our dev tools. And then we're going to pipe that again and pick a destination. So again, we're going to take our SAS files, and then we're going to pipe that through the preprocessor, and then pipe that out to its final destination. So we take the SAS file, convert it to a CSS file. Pretty simple. What that allows us to do now is if we put that in our grunt file, our Gulp file, That's all we have to do in the terminal to compile our Sass. So you just do gulp compile Sass, and it'll take care of wherever the files are and stick them in the correct place. Another common one, again, I'm lazy, so I use CoffeeScript, Ruby. Yay! So again, we're going to set up the dependency. Put this in our gulp file. You'll notice things are going to look pretty similar as you set, especially the preprocessed side stuff. It looks mostly the same because it is. So again, you're choosing your source directory, piping it through the Coffee preprocessor, and then piping it back out into a static file, a static JavaScript file. And then you can call that task in the command line with just gulp compile coffee, and it'll compile take your CoffeeScript files and compile them to JavaScript. You can do the same thing with JADE. So JADE's an HTML preprocessor. I told you I was lazy. It's all preprocessors all the time, everywhere. You install your dependency. Now, JADE has a few other things that you need to do because JADE allows you to have local variables that you can parse in. So we set those up as a variable, and we're basically just piping JADE to whatever our local variables are, and it just spits out, takes JADE files and turns them to HTML. And if we wanted to use that in the command line, that's what we would get. So if we wanted to combine all of those together, we could probably do something like this. We're going to create a default task. So whenever we go to the command line, we just go gulp, and it does its thing. So we want to compile the Sass, compile the JADE, compile our CoffeeScript. So that's kind of how it would look. So let's dig into something a bit more entertaining. So I really enjoy using static site generators. They're fantastic. So for clients or customers that don't really need a CMS and don't want to edit their content, if I need to rock out a static site pretty quick, I'll typically use Middleman. So Middleman is a Ruby-based static site generator built on top of Sinatra. It's great, but we can take some of those core concepts of pretty much any static site generator and rock out a really simple generator with Gulp without too much effort and without really writing anything, really. So this is an example that I got from Andrew DC from GitHub, learning how to do this stuff myself. It was great. So the first thing that we need to do is within our Gulp file, we're going to declare all of our dependencies. So in this case, we're declaring Gulp, right? We always have to declare Gulp, so we know that it is. We're going to use something called Gulp util. We'll dig into what this is in a second. And then we're using both versions of Sass. We're using both the libsass and the Ruby version of Sass, so we can pick whichever one we want to use. And then we're using a plugin called Auto Prefixer. So Auto Prefixer is a really nice plugin. Like if you don't want to use Compass and you don't want to use Bourbon to handle your CSS remix ins, Auto Prefix will take something like Box Shadow and automatically generate the correct prefixes for you without having to type it yourself. It's pretty magical. So it'll do that through your CSS for you. We have a simple rename because we want to be able to rename our, a simple way to rename our preprocessed files to our process files. And they're using live reload. Who doesn't use, who uses live reload? It's pretty awesome. So if you don't know what live reload is, it is amazing. Basically what it does is it runs in the background in the terminal typically. And as you make changes, it automatically refreshes your browser. So if you're changing HTML or changing CSS, you can keep your hands on the keyboard and continue to code, and the browser refreshes as you save. So it's amazing, so we can build that in. And then we're going to create just a really simple server so we can see the changes that we're making. And then we're using something called Plumber. So Plumber is a nice add-on to get better error management inside of Gulp. So as you're watching files, it gives you smarter output. So if something explodes in a watcher, it gives you more information so you can try to troubleshoot. We're going to set up a server and then set up a path. And then we're going to set up some, basically some globals that we want to set for where our templates are going to be located and then where our source files are for our Sass. So that's the very beginning of the document. Not too much. We're just calling plugins, setting those dependencies. Now, for any static site generator, we have this concept of templates and partials. So we want to be able to create a template file and have that wrap like our HTML5 doc type, our head, any of our assets, things that would go JavaScript towards the end. We don't have to include those on every single page. We want to set up a template file, and then we want to be able to have this concept of partials, which are not standalone files, files that we were going to bring in another file. So we can do that with Gulp with this really simple task. So this is where file include comes in. Now we want to be able to include files. So we're basically looking at the path for our templates. We're going to call them tpl.html, so we know it's a template file. We're going to include it. We're going to rename it as an HTML file. So we take our template. Whenever we include a partial in those files, we're going to spit it back out as an HTML file, and we're going to spit those out in the root directory. So then we just start our live reload so we can see the pages. So if we change things, and it'll automatically update the browser. And that's all you have to do to create a template and partial file system for a static site generator. So not a lot to it. Again, we're just using plugins that have already been built. Now the second thing we want to be able to do is we want to be able to compile Sass. So again, we're creating a Sass task that allows us to take our Sass files and spit them out as CSS. So pretty much the same. We're passing in a few different parameters for Sass, specifically letting it know that we want to spit out our CSS in expanded view instead of compiled or compressed. We're going to use our source comments that tie into source maps, and then any errors in our Sass, we're going to spit that out in the console. So we have our source, and then later on we define our destination. We're just spitting it out in a CSS folder. So we're going to take all of our Sass folders, spit it out in a CSS folder. And again, we're using live reload for this, so whenever we change our Sass files, it's going to refresh the browser for us. That's it. That's how we compile a Sass file in our really simple static site generator. This is the Ruby version. So this is libsass. This is Ruby. They're roughly the same on how they work. Now the third thing is we want to set up a local server so we can actually look at the static site that we're creating. So a little bit more to it. The first thing we're doing is we're creating a connect task. Now in that connect task, we're defining a few things to connect to the server. So we need a port number. So we're just using 5678. So we could go to roughly localhost and do port 5678, and we would see the sites that were, or the pages that we're generating. Now we have live reload set to false on these because we don't really need that there. So from there, we're creating a specific function that allows us to encapsulate what we do to create a watcher. So we don't want to have redundant watchers for our HTML and for our CSS. We're going to create something there. So we're going to watch on a specific port and then pipe that up to the server so we know what's going on. So we're watching specifically our Sass and our template files. And then for the watchers themselves, we just do a simple watch task for our Sass. We're going to call our create watcher function, right? So the function we created there, we're going to call it there so it's nice and small. We don't have to use that snippet of code for every single time we want to watch something. Do the same thing for Ruby. And from there, that's it, really. I mean, it's only about 100 lines of code, a little less than 100 lines of code, to create a really simple static site generator that sets up templates and partials, handles working with preprocessors, sets up a server for us, sets up watchers with live reload so we can see what's going on. So to kind of wrap all that up, we create a default task that does our file include, Sass, connect, and watch. So all we have to do is cd to that directory, run the gulp command, our server starts up, our watchers start up, and we have a static site generator. And this is the one for Ruby. So if you're doing Ruby instead of libsass, we have a use Ruby. All right, and you just call it that way. So there's a lot that you can do with Gulp to do really simple things with not a lot of code. Again, there are 800 or so plugins that could take care of probably the majority of things you could think you would need to do in an automated system. Now, these are some of the plugins that I really enjoy, that I think are amazing. So Gulp concat is pretty simple. We're just concatenating files. So we take many files, dump it into one. That's how you would set it up. Again, it's going to look fairly similar. We set a source, the files we want to start with. We're going to call the specific plugin. So in this case, we take our source files, we concatenate them, and we spit them out into our destination. Uglify is, I'm not sure why they call it Uglify. They should just call it minify, because that's what it does. So it's just going to minify a file or a group of files. And it works exactly the same way. So we have our source files, we call our plugin, have it do its magic, and then we spit out the minified files. Now you notice in this one that we're actually using concat and minify in the same task. So that's kind of what we're doing. So we're going to minify and concatenate everything and stick it all into all.js. Gulp clean. So if you're doing a static site system or a static site generator, you're typically going to have some type of build directory that's going to have your static HTML, static JavaScript, static CSS somewhere. So there's a clean plugin that'll clear that out before it recompiles everything. So it's just handy to have just in case. You would set it up that way. And then Gulp Plumber. So again, Plumber's been really nice because the default error handling inside of Gulp is not very nice. I mean, it's okay, but it could be better. So Plumber kind of fixes all that. So it gives us better error handling and messaging in the command line, especially if a watcher crashes and burns, as we're trying to watch our CSS or HTML or JavaScript, anything like that. It kind of lets us know what's going on. This is kind of how you would set it up. So in the case of SAS, so we're using the Compass SAS plugin here. Whenever we take our source file and we try and pipe those through SAS, if there's an error, it's going to spit it out in the console before it creates the files. Gulp rename is exactly what it says. It renames files. It looks kind of like that. This is a combination of a handful of files. So again, we use this when we're concatenating and minifying everything and renaming things to a single file name. Gulp watch, we've already talked about this one fairly substantially. It just watches files and changes them if you make a change. It's pretty good. This is how you would set up something like that, a bit more complex. So one of the things that I really liked is, well, one of the things that I didn't like is, whenever you set up dependencies, you have to do the dependencies in two locations. You have dependencies that you do in your index.json file that has all the metadata for the project, and then you have to do the dependencies again inside of your Gulp file. So what Gulp load plugins does is it looks in that initial JSON file's dependencies, and it includes those in your Gulp file. So you only have to do them in one location, and then it spits it in your Gulp file, which is pretty good. So it's if you're doing a simple Gulp project, it's probably not a big deal. But as you're writing larger, more complex Gulp projects, it's nice to have that single source of dependencies instead of having two different locations in case you forget. I would. This is how you would set it up. So again, we're including Gulp, and then it's really just a few extra lines of code. So we're setting a variable. We're going to call it Gulp load plugins, and then we're going to require our plugin file, and then we set another variable. We can call it plugin, call it whatever you want. We're going to call it plugins, and then we just call our initial, our previous variable, and that handles our plugins for us. So it works out pretty well. Live reload we talked about. Now, I really like live reload. And I had never heard of browser sync until I started working on this presentation. And it is absolutely magical. So live reload's great because it allows you to keep your hands on the keyboard and refresh the browser for you without too much trouble. Now, what browser sync is, it's basically a newer, up-to-date, more powerful, super magical version of live reload. It still refreshes the browser whenever you do file changes, but it has a few extra goodies. It'll inject CSS, meaning that if you change the CSS file, it doesn't actually refresh the browser. It will inject the CSS into the browser without refreshing. So if you're working on a single-page app or something that has state attached to it, you can see the changes without affecting the state at reloading. The second thing that it does that's just blew my mind is you can actually have multiple browsers open at the same time. You make your changes, it refreshes all the browsers you have open, which is pretty cool if you're testing multiple things. But the magic thing is, let's say you have Firefox, Chrome, and Safari open, and you're working on a form. If you type in form information on one browser, it pipes that to the other 3 browsers. If you click on a button, it submits to the other 3 browsers as well. If you scroll, it does the other browsers for you. It is absolutely magical. And it doesn't even require a browser plugin to do that. All that happens behind the scenes. You just have to use browser sync to do that, and it handles all that for you. So that was the niftiest thing that I learned doing this presentation. We have Gulp Util, which is kind of a nice utility belt for Gulp. It just brings in extra functionality for logging errors, coloring console output, things like that. And then if you're accustomed to using Yeoman and Grunt, there's actually a Yeoman and Gulp set up here under Generator Gulp Web App. So that's pretty much all I have. And we can do questions if you want. You can clap if you want. You can totally clap. Any questions? There's one in the back.
Yeah, what's the standard way of dealing with a fairly typical situation about a bunch of vanilla JS, some COFFESCRIPT, JSX, and I just want to drive everything, ever compile, and type everything you want to have.
Are they all in the same directory, or do you have?
Oh yeah, they're all mixed up.
Okay. So it's going to do that matching. So they have some really good matchers. So you're typically going to match based off of the file extension. So let's say you have a JavaScript directory with both CoffeeScript and JavaScript files. You would just set up your, you could probably do a couple different tasks where you have a task that's going to compile your CoffeeScript, spit that out into JavaScript, and then you'll just take your JavaScript, your vanilla JavaScript, and then concatenate all those outputted files into one. So you don't actually have to, you probably do that in a single task. Because you can do the pre-process step, store that in memory, and then take your JavaScript files, and then concatenate and minify what you have there, and then spit it out into your concatenated file. Probably. In my head, that's the way it seems like it would work. We can try it and see what happens. Any other questions? All right.
Concurrency is obviously a there are sometimes when you don't want it. You want to make sure some tasks happen.
Yeah, so that's actually built into Gulp. We didn't review it here, but it is there. So you can manage concurrency at a pretty granular level. So within your tasks, you can actually define dependencies. So you can make things synchronous if you want, and basically define in your dependency that within this task, this needs to run first before any of this other stuff happens. So that's in the docs. We can talk about it after if you want. I have it, so for anything static, anything where I'm spitting out static content, I basically just have that built in. So whenever I'm compiling something, I clean it and spit it back in. It just helps any oddities that might appear. And it's pretty trivial to do. What's that? Yeah, so if you're doing it where it's compiling on the fly, it's probably not a big deal. Typically, this is how I do it in Middleman, and it's probably going to be the same thing you would do in Gulp. In that you have your watcher running, it just does its stuff and just replaces what's there. And then whenever you're syncing to a server somewhere, you just run clean in. So you would have a build task, and then you would have kind of a deploy task. So your deploy task would run the clean, and then spit out your new files and spit up to a server. Any other questions? All right. Thanks, everybody.